We will first start off during the American Revolution. Although most of Britain's North American colonies rebelled to eventually form America, there were still a few British colonies that never rebelled, which were Quebec, Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, East and West Florida, and their Caribbean holdings. Most of the British colonies in North America ended up eventually forming my country Canada, while the 13 colonies went on to form America. Now, for this scenario, our first point of divergence will be to expand the revolution to the rest of the British American colonies. Before we do that though, we first need to know why these British colonies didn't rebel from Britain in the first place, and to do that, we will first need to go back to the 7 Years' War. During that war, the British and the French fought each other, and France's side lost, resulting in the French being forced to cede all their North American claims to Britain, which was an absolutely devastating and embarrassing blow to the French, who wanted to exact revenge, which they ended up doing when the Americans started the American Revolution, and they supplied and helped train the colonists to fight against the British, and because of their efforts, the Americans were eventually able to gain their independence. Now, before the 7 Years' War, France only really settled the lands around the St. Lawrence River, which is why today in Canada, Quebec is, well, Quebec. And they speak French, while all the other territories in French Louisiana now speak English today because they weren't really settled by the French. Now, after Britain won the 7 Years' War, all of this territory was ceded to Britain, including the parts around the St. Lawrence River that were settled by the French, and the problem with that was that they now controlled a highly populated area full of Roman Catholic French people who were not happy to have been conquered. This led to Britain signing the Quebec Act, which not only let the Quabecois keep all the rights and freedoms they had before they were conquered, but also expanded their territorial control to these lands. Because of that, this was actually one of the reasons why the colonists rebelled, because now they were surrounded by the natives and French people that the Americans believed should be colonized by them. The Quebec Act was signed on June 22, 1774, and the American Revolution started on April 19, 1775, which means the Quebec Act was signed only 10 months before the Revolution started, and it took about 11 years for the Act to be created after the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1763. The reason why it took 11 years for the Act to be created in the first place was because after the Treaty of Paris, the British Proclamation of 1763 that organized all Britain's new territories reduced New France to the St. Lawrence River and renamed it Quebec, and because of that, their fur trade routes were cut off, and on top of that, the French law was replaced with English law, and they restricted their religious rights. So the Quabecois were obviously not very happy with that arrangement, which eventually led to the Quebec Act being signed, which got rid of all those issues, but also caused even more issues for the rest of the colonies that were unhappy with the major expansion of Quebec. Now in our timeline, the act was pretty controversial and rushed, so that way, the British would be able to make it so that the Quabecois would refrain from potentially joining the American cause when tensions were starting to rise between the British and the colonists, which ended up working. In this timeline, if the British decided to not pass the act and instead double down on assimilating the Quabecois, then they would either not create the act in the first place, or they would decide not to implement it, and it wouldn't end up being signed in this alternate timeline. That would mean that the Quabecois would still hate British rule just like they did before the act was signed, and they would want to rebel as well. Now, we fast forward to the American Revolution, and Quebec joins in as well, but they would be fighting on their own side to secure their own independence because of their cultural distinctions from the rest of the 13 colonies. However, since them and the 13 colonies would now have a common goal, they would put aside their differences and work together to defeat the British. With the Quabecois working together with the rest of the 13 colonies, they now have way better access to the rest of Britain's colonies, which they could then push into during the Revolution. During the Revolution, France fought the Battle of the Saints, which was a naval battle in the Caribbean that the British ended up winning, which led to 4 French ships being captured and 1 being destroyed, and with it, French hopes of dominating more of the Caribbean. Now, the French Navy at this time was actually very competent and could have theoretically won this battle, which could have led to more Caribbean expansion. This is very important because the Caribbean colonies were extremely valuable. Just the little island of Jamaica had roughly the same economic value to the British as all the 13 colonies combined did. If islands like Jamaica could be captured by the French and the Spanish, and even outposts like Gibraltar and Minorca, then in the peace treaty, they would be able to force higher concessions from Britain, and if France could capture Jamaica, they may be able to negotiate the old holdings in India in exchange for it, which would allow them to have a foothold in India again. Now, during this alternate American Revolution, Quebec's involvement in it will start to majorly affect the tide of the revolution throughout this scenario. For starters, in our timeline, the revolutionaries actually led initially a pretty successful but costly campaign that captured most of the St. Lawrence River Valley between 1775 to 1776 that saw the capture of Montreal and the besieging of Quebec City. Because the Quebec Act was signed, however, they weren't able to really convince any of the locals to join the American Revolution, and they eventually lost the territory to Britain and never regained it, which was a devastating loss to the revolutionaries. In this alternate timeline, Quebec would rebel with the rest of the 13 colonies, so not only would they have access to that crucial choking point, but they also never would have had to launch that costly campaign. The revolutionaries could then divert those resources to kicking out the British earlier in the rest of the colonies that were breaking away from Britain, and they could then focus on conquering the Indian reserves like they did in our timeline, but much earlier, and without the St. Lawrence River, the British wouldn't be able to supply the natives, which would make the campaign much more quicker. Before that though, the revolutionaries would first need to focus on conquering the northern parts of the Great Lakes, which in the modern day make up southern Ontario. The reason why they weren't able to conquer the northern parts of the Great Lakes in our timeline was because the British had a heavy presence across the St. Lawrence River, but since Quebec would rebel in this timeline, British supply lines across the St. Lawrence River would be completely cut off, which the Americans would be able to take advantage of the cut off British ports to eventually push into the populated regions of the Great Lakes, which will give the Americans full control over the Great Lakes. Also, by being able to conquer the cut off ports, the Americans could also take over British ships to use them in the Revolution to traverse across the St. Lawrence River, which the Quebecois could also do earlier in the Revolution when they rebelled from Britain and secure their part of the St. Lawrence River. After the revolutionaries would now have encircled the native reserves, they then would have a much easier time conquering them compared to our timeline. As for the rest of the British colonies, they were heavily militarized and populated by the British and British loyalists, so the Americans wouldn't be able to conquer those areas. But in Nova Scotia, there were still plenty of New England settlers that supported the revolution, so although the Americans wouldn't be able to conquer most of the coast of Nova Scotia, they could theoretically be able to push into more of the interior regions of Nova Scotia to liberate the small towns and settlements there. After that, it's pretty much impossible for the revolutionaries to expand anywhere else, so they would eventually sign an alternate Treaty of Paris. In the peace treaty, the Americans would obviously gain independence from the British and gain control over all the territories they got in our timeline, as well as all the Great Lakes and the interior parts of Nova Scotia. Quebec would also gain their independence as well, which would be separate from the rest of America, and they may be able to negotiate control over more of Britain's territories than they originally had. The rest of the British territories, Britain would still keep because again, during this time, there were simply too many loyalists there that the Americans wouldn't have been able to fight against. As for Rupert's Land, the British would most likely get the Hudson Bay Company to split it and sell it to the Americans and the Quebecois, either in the peace treaty or sometime after it, because the territory is now way harder to defend and not valuable enough to hold because those territories were not settled. We will say for the sake of the scenario that in the peace treaty, Britain does sell Rupert's Land and would also most likely give Quebec some of it as well. But just know that's also possible that they sell it at a later date, or they forcefully claim it later. With that, America now ends the revolution more bigger and much more powerful than they did in our timeline. And globally, Britain has lost even more influence than they did in our timeline. Post-revolution, it's very likely that even with a couple more colonies, the colonies are still able to successfully confederate to form the United States of America. British loyalists in our timeline mainly fled to the colonies that would end up becoming Canada, but with some of Britain's territories gone, they will instead flee mainly to Newfoundland and Labrador. What's left of Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, and the Caribbean colonies Britain has left. Quebec and America would enjoy good trade relations with each other and France, but Quebec would be afraid of the Americans once they successfully confederate, probably because later on they will end up being conquered because Quebec. Until that happens though, Quebec's role will mostly be as a buffer state between America and what's left of Britain's North American holdings. In our timeline, a significant thing that the Americans had to worry about was renewed British aggression from its colonies that they still had, which led to them militarizing the border territory with Britain. In this alternate timeline, this major constraint that the Founding Fathers had to deal with would be basically non-existent, because they would control those British territories in this timeline, and Quebec would also act as a buffer state between them and Newfoundland, so the Founding Fathers would be less overstretched in things they need to worry about in this alternate timeline, meaning they will have more time to implement some of the ideas that I have and that they had during the founding of America. For starters, there's slavery. Although it's unrealistic for America to straight up ban it, the Founding Fathers could implement an amendment within the Constitution that would fully ban slavery by the mid-1800s and put in laws to prevent the expansion of the industry in the meantime. By doing that, in the future, that would either completely prevent the American Civil War or at the very least make it far less devastating than in our timeline, which would lead to a much better Reconstruction era. Other things, like the Founding Fathers personally freeing their slaves, could also help influence the American population into abandoning slavery early. Next up is America's early military. During its founding, the Americans were actually afraid of having a powerful army because they feared that one day it would rebel against America and take it over like what has happened in other empires historically, and instead they relied on local military militias to fight their battles. With Britain basically kicked off of the continent, combined with Britain losing their Indian holdings and basically all the global colonial influence like France did after the 7 Years' War, the Americans will no longer be nearly as paranoid about Britain as they were in our timeline, and instead of relying on militias to defend themselves against Britain, they are now freed up from having to focus on that in this timeline. And they can instead focus on creating the amendments that would help to prevent a military takeover that they did in our timeline, and raise a small army as well as a small navy using the naval ships that they would have captured in the St. Lawrence River that they could repurpose for trade purposes with other countries, and also because that would be seen as the main defense they would need to have against Britain since they are now basically kicked off of the continent, and also for defense against and trade with Quebec in the St. Lawrence River, where tensions would slowly start to build over time between the Americans and the Quabequois. One last thing about the military that I would like to mention is a suggestion from Unreal History that he would be covering in a greater extent on his video, which would be to have Alexandra, John Forsyth, and Jean Samuel Pauly come over to America to sell their gun patents to America, which they tried to do in Britain and France, but failed to do so. By the Americans being able to get their hands on this gun technology, they will immediately have the upper edge in gun technology than any other country in the world, which they will be able to use to their advantage. Again, Unreal History will be going much more in depth on what these guns can actually do because he's actually an American. But to oversimplify, they're able to fire off instantly, reload quicker, and be able to withstand harsher climates which other guns couldn't do at the time. This will play a huge factor in America's expansion, which we'll talk about next video. Moving back to the changes that the Founding Fathers brought in to make, one extremely important change that I would like to make is not having any political parties, which Washington himself warned not to do, and he in fact was the only president to not rule America under a political party. Funnily enough, he was completely correct in this, and now the Americans are stuck with a two-party system we all know and hate, which has divided the country immensely. Instead, what they should do is ban political parties that transcend presidents, and instead have presidential candidates create their own political parties as more of a personal brand that they can run on, and then the party dies once the candidate either steps down from the presidency after serving their 2 terms, or steps down from politics. For example, Unreal History wants to run for presidency in real life, which he's doing under the Bull Moose Party. In this alternate timeline, he would be running against multiple other candidates with their own personal brands, so that way, people are voting for individual ideas and not for a party that can be corrupted over time, which is also happening in our timeline. Then, if Unreal History were to win and become the president and serve his 2 terms, he will then step down and the Bull Moose Party will cease to exist. And the same thing will happen if he tries to run for president and fails and eventually decides to give up on politics, or he steps down from the presidency during his term, and then his party will cease to exist unless if he decides to get back into politics again. Also, of course, once he serves his 2 terms, he can't start another party because that would violate the 2 terms rule. One other change that I would like to make is to prevent monopolies from being able to form. We can see nowadays, especially after the release of the Epstein files, that America is clearly run by elite evil oligarchs. There's strong evidence that suggests that these people began to rise when America started to industrialize, which we will need to prevent from happening, otherwise we will end up where we are in our timeline. In this timeline, industrialization in America will start to happen sooner, with the mass production of the better quality guns that the Americans will gain access to in this timeline, combined with the repurposed smaller British Navy that would be used for trade, which would help to enrich the Americans faster earlier on. First, we need to create institutions early on in order to prevent elites from corrupting America over time. As much as I would like to talk about the subject, I can't really go into depth about it or any other things that need to be changed early on, but stuff like not allowing banks to basically have all the power they have now, not allowing industries to grow way too big and powerful, not allowing people to own way too much parts of different corporations, not allowing insider trading, not allowing political boundaries to be redrawn by political parties to make votes more powerful, not allowing a single group or groups of people to create multiple businesses that control lots of extremely vital parts of society, not allowing families to slowly over generations gain more and more control over society until they control or have major influence over every major corporation and vital part of society, and the list goes on and on and on about how much corrupt activities are going on in America that will need to be addressed early on. The Founding Fathers simply didn't have enough time to democratically put these practices into law in our timeline, and they still want to be able to do it in this timeline too. However, these political future issues to the founders of America have now spiraled into so much corruption that cannot possibly be democratically fixed at this point. The Founding Fathers were aware of many of these issues, but again, they simply didn't have enough time to implement them. But we need them to be implemented democratically over time. Maybe the Founding Fathers read a book or something about all the future issues that could happen that need to be solved or something, and maybe also in the future school system there could be history classes where children learn about the American Revolution but also of the ideas that were never implemented by the Founding Fathers, so one day they can grow up and eventually implement those ideas. But whatever it takes, the potential issues that have now become major issues in our timeline need to be solved in America's infancy before it ends up spiraling out of control into what we have to deal with now. And with that note, I will be ending the first part of the scenario here. So far, we've gone through the revolutionary and the new nation/federal period of America, and next up we'll be discussing the Napoleonic Wars, an alternate war of 1812, and maybe even the Latin American Wars of Independence as well as all the other eras of America in the future. So stay tuned. Thank you Unreal History for having me on the channel, and thank you to all of you guys for watching the video. For those of you guys who are not subscribed to my channel, then please consider doing so because I got a large category of videos that I know you guys will all love, including Unreal History's version of this scenario. Also, for those of you guys who haven't, subscribe to Unreal History, and until next time, don't get anyone pregnant, but if you do, make sure they're hot, and I'll see you all next time.